and welcome everyone. My guest today is Kjetil Tronvoll. Kjetil Tronvoll is Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies at Oslo New University College. He has written multiple commentaries on Ethiopia, has also observed elections in Ethiopia. He has also advised reconciliation processes throughout Africa and has also been involved in international mediation efforts as an advisor, and the right kind of guest that we need now for what's happening in Ethiopia in terms of the mediation efforts, the failed mediation efforts by the AU and other actors. So really looking forward to this, Kjetil, and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me, Tghat.
My pleasure. So why don't we start with one of your latest tweets, Kjetil. You said that the AU has been working in collaboration with the Ethiopia and the Eritrean regimes, and it has been providing some sort of red tape obstruction to other peace efforts. And I think it would be interesting if you could expand on that.
Yes, certainly. I think the issue of the peace negotiation process, if I can call it that, it has been very little negotiation, but it has been a process to try to reach a stage where the parties could actually negotiate. That process has been a very much hobbled, feeble process from more or less all actors involved, but certainly so the African Union, which is vested with the authority to handle this case. And I will not go too much into the details, but let me go back just to the start of the conflict in November 2 years ago, more or less on anniversary we are approaching. The AU was very quick to announce after the outbreak of hostilities a panel of eminent elders, as they call it, 3 eminent ex-head of states of Africa, which AU designated to try to facilitate talks between Mekele and Addis. But immediately that initiative was brushed aside by Abiy Ahmed and calling it an untimely and unwarranted intervention into domestic affairs, and AU went quiet. AU stayed quiet, as far as I remember, from November 2020 until April 2021, more or less 6 months. They didn't say anything, they didn't take any action, they didn't do anything, even though EU, US, UN and other bilaterals called for and tried to mobilize a peace process. They designated special envoys and representatives to the conflict. AU was paralyzed. Then they started to re-engage, so to say, and with the appointment then of General Obasanjo of Nigeria as the high representative to the conflict. And already there's kind of second move where stumbling due to the appointment of an envoy. And in all, in all wars, in all conflicts, if you're going to try to negotiate, if you're going to try to be the mediator between the belligerent parties, the first thing you have to reassure is that you have the trust of both belligerent parties, that you have the trust individually and institutionally to actually play a role in negotiating. Well, General Obasanjo from day one didn't have the trust of Mekele. For various reasons, we can assume both his religious background as a Pentecostal Christian aligned with Abiy Ahmed, that the fact that he was kind of recommended and hinted at by the Ethiopian government, his background from Nigeria, both as head of state, but possibly also as a general, or as a, not a general at that time, but as a high-level officer involved in the Biafra starvation and the war on Biafra. The historical parallel brought up again today to illustrate the case of Tigray and the siege of Tigray and the starvation of the Tigrayan people. as a parallel to the starvation of the Biafran people conducted by the Nigerian government at that time. So a lot of things were pointing against General Obasanjo as an objective mediator from the start. And TPLF, or the government of Tigray, the regional government of Tigray, were hesitant to trust him. And we have seen since then both the fact that, you know, and with all due respect to the general, he is an elder statesman. He doesn't necessarily have both the stamina or the vigorousness to engage full-time into the process. It is a part-time work for him. His office is severely understaffed. He doesn't have the necessary experts and expertise to understand the complexities and the ideologies and the historicities of this conflict, how it is anchored. So it is a lot pointing against the fact that he can do an effective mediation, both in person and as a team. But if you take it another level, the African Union itself has a very peculiar history in Ethiopia and in peacemaking in general on the African continent, you can say. I don't think you can point to that many success stories where the African Union have played the crucial determining role in settling peace in any African conflict as such. And certainly not in the Horn or in Ethiopia. From its very origin as Organization of African Unity, later on AU, they have been very hesitant to engage in anything relating to Ethiopian domestic affairs, basically because the AU headquarters is in Addis Ababa. They are afraid that they will step on some toes, which will make it difficult for AU to work and to be present and to operationalize their agenda as they are in Ethiopia. That's one thing. And of course, the other side of that is that since they have been in Ethiopia since its establishment, of course, Ethiopian contacts, Ethiopian informers, Ethiopian plans, Ethiopian spies within the AU system is deeply embedded. Ethiopia knows immediately what AU thinks and want to act upon before they know themselves and can intervene to try to stop it. So AU will never work as an objective independent agency to any dire political issue or conflict which relates to Ethiopia. And we have historical precedents to say this. This is not just based on the current Tigray conflict. This is based on conflicts with the Eritrean-Ethiopian war in 1998-2000, with the insurgencies in the 70s and 80s, and so on, going back. So everything talks against the fact that AU should play the so-called leading role in facilitating peace talks, or no, initially cessation of hostilities talks. Let me add, because these have several layers of kind of interpretations or of impediments for AU to work properly. The international system, the multilateral system, when it comes to mitigating or resolving conflict, is based on the outlines of the UN Charter. And the UN Charter obviously vests the authority for maintaining international peace and stability with the Security Council of the UN. But the UN Charter also says that first of all, one should try to seek a solution and negotiation with the first resort handler, which is the regional based organizations, AU. They are the primary respondent to a conflict in Africa. And in that regard, it is natural that the AU takes that role. But it has been 2 years now, coming up to 2 years, without AU managing to do anything when it comes to maneuvering the process forward to a formalized cessation of hostilities, to a formalized ceasefire, to a formalized process of negotiating a peace agreement. So how long time should the UN and UN Security Council give to AU to try to fix this, when we know that it is terrible, terrible circumstances happening in Tigray towards the civilian population? It is horrendous casualty numbers in the active war. It is a humanitarian disaster in the making. It is probably even maybe a genocide in the making. And here it comes the added element of international politics and geopolitics. And Ethiopia has been very clever to play a diplomatic game where they have rallied the African base of Pan-Africanism, so-called, and calling out any kind of Western, European, American criticism, comments on the conflict as neo-imperialists and as hidden agendas. And they have rallied behind this, in my view, rather defunct slogan of African solutions to African problems. This was a very, very apt slogan, actually first coined by the Ghanaian economist Tghat after the Somali Mogadishu collapse and the US intervention in Mogadishu at that time. But the very prominent Ghanaian economist who sadly passed away earlier this year, his interpretation of that was not only that the old colonial powers were to blame for the problems experienced in African states today, but the fact that African states had been taken over by a black elite which continued the extractive policies of the former colonial masters. And he blamed the vampire state, as he called it, that the internal problems of bad leadership, corruption, military vandalism, and so on and so forth, exploiting the African people, and that the African states had to put their house in order and not continuously blaming the old colonialist. That is the background of that slogan. If you look upon how it is used today by Ethiopia and rallying that kind of, in my view, false premise of Pan-Africanism, it goes counter to the original meaning of the term, of the slogan. But paradoxically, and here's a criticism of not of AU, but a criticism of UN and of EU and US and the internationals, that what we see is that it appears, at least, that the international community, at least the Western world, is quite happy and complacent with delegating this conflict to the authority of AU, because then we don't need to take any action. The UN doesn't need to take any responsibility. The EU and US can take the back seat and point to the AU and say that, no, you have the lead. You have to guide the process. We shouldn't interfere as such. We shouldn't shoulder that responsibility. So it is a cushion for our own complacency in accepting the situation as it is. I'm not disregarding the US have tried to have a back channel. They have tried to facilitate face-to-face meeting 3 times with Addis and Mekele representatives. But you see the fallback position always in the public statement is that this is an African AU-led process. It is a process which needs to ensure the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of Ethiopia, all the same wording that the Ethiopian government and AU is using. So I think it is also a way for the West, for UN in particular, to throw our hands and say, you know, this is too complicated, this is too complex, this we shouldn't really dig into, because it is a high possibility of failure to deliver anything. And really, it's a small, it's a big country in Africa, but it's in the periphery. It doesn't really affect us as such. I think that's a very, very, very grave mistake. Obviously, it is now a regional security threat. It's not only domestic affairs. Eritrea is fully involved militarily, politically. It is spreading to other neighboring states. It has its geopolitical tentacles. So definitely this conflict should be taken away from AU as the authority and lifted up to the UN Security Council, as they are vested with the authority to handle international regional security concerns. Sorry, that was a long answer to your first question, Tghat, but I needed to unpack the several layers of what this involves.
Yeah, I think it was good that you took your time to really lay out the thinking of the various actors in the international community. I think in terms of the African Union, people know why they chose Obasanjo, for instance, and the thinking of the shenanigans, and also I think there is a cabal of people in the AU who run the operations, at the very least the political affairs, and that is a well kind of traveled road. But it was also interesting that you gave us a cold, hard analysis of the indifference and explanation of the indifference and the very lackadaisical approach of the international community, very laid back. But I think I will pick up on one of the points you raised towards the end, which is that Eritrea is now in the not just in the fray, but Eritrea actually now had the leading role in terms of the war. Ethiopia, to the extent that is involved, is by providing kind of human resource. It's Eritrean commanders who are in charge of proceedings. And my question is, yes, I understand different actors in the international community could excuse their disengagement by saying this is an African affair. We have delegated the matter to the AU, as it should be. It's none of our business, and everything is fine. I understand why they would want to say that, but isn't their interest on the line by allowing Eritrea to wreak havoc in the Horn of Africa? It's not difficult to imagine the kind of, even if we think in terms of immigration alone, never mind other aspects, Eritrea now is a source of humanitarian disaster everywhere, and multiply what it would be able to do if it controlled Ethiopia and other countries as well. So do they not see the disaster looming in allowing Eritrea to be in charge? That's, I think, the one thing that I can't really explain. I think many people find it extremely difficult to understand.
Yes, myself included. I find it difficult to understand that the international community hasn't been aware of Isaias Afwerki's agenda from day one. But, you know, again, that is diplomacy. Embassy staff is rotating every third year, maximum every fourth year. Foreign Affairs Ministry staff at their home offices are rotating from one desk to the other regularly. The institutional memory in the international system on the behavior of crooks, of dictators, is very weak. And Isaias have acted very, very much on the same standard operating procedures since 1991 until today. It shouldn't be any surprise that Isaias have taken this role in the war on Tigray since November 2000. It shouldn't be any surprise. But remember, just the year before the war broke out, Eritrea was suspended from all sanctions, both the unilateral sanctions by US, but also the UN security sanctions, believing actually that he wanted peace and stability in the Horn of Africa. So it is a total naivete among the international community about the thinking, the ideology, the agency of Isaias Afwerki. And we have seen that year after year after year, new ambassadors coming to Asmara, trying to believing that, I can talk him into becoming a social democrat. It doesn't work like that. It will never work. Isaias will never change. And as long as he is in power, the Eritrean regime is very predictable in how they will behave. And we have to understand that, and we have to design strategies how to contain it until the Eritrean people is bold enough to change their own government. Hopefully in a short time, but we don't know. So I agree, the agenda of Isaias Afwerki in this war is doesn't have any positive elements in it, neither for Tigray and the Tigrayan people, nor for Ethiopia and Ethiopian stability, nor for the Horn of Africa. Look, for instance, of the recent flare-up of the insurgency in Djibouti, very much likely inspired by Asmara. Look about the agenda of Isaias Afwerki in Ethiopia beyond Tigray. He has always talked about Ethiopia as a house of cards and his interest to collapse that house of cards, so to say, into instability, so he can play a role in that chaos. How he has infiltrated the economic black market system of Ethiopia, how he has infiltrated in the Ethiopian intelligence services, and so on and so forth. It doesn't bode well for Ethiopian stability post-Tigray war, if we can use that term. His agenda towards Tigray and the Tigrayan people is quite blatant and obvious, and we all know that. And it's terrible to think of that he is allowed by Ethiopian government to actually implement his genocidal, atrocity-driven warfare against an Ethiopian people. I think it is, I don't think of any historical parallel in Africa or beyond where such a shrewd policy is implemented by a government against its own people. But that's what the Tigrayan people are facing. The Eritrean army is deeply, deeply involved. On the northern front, they are in control, as you say. They have embedded probably something between or around 50,000 or maybe more of ENDF troops, which are under Eritrean command. Talking about protecting Ethiopian sovereignty. Ethiopian government has discarded their sovereignty by offering their troops to the command of a foreign country who are attacking their own people. And we know how the warfare is driven on the northern front by this army or these contingents. And we know the consequences of what will happen in the areas they are now taking control of. Because we saw what happened last year. This is based on empirical facts. This is not something I am kind of inventing or other people are inventing. We know what happened in the areas controlled by the Eritrean Defense Forces last year in Tigray. Probably much worse will happen in the current offensives if new territories are taken by Eritrean forces once again.
Well, I think one of the mysteries in terms of the vast majority of the Ethiopian elite is that they are not alarmed by the prospect of someone who has pushed his country into beggary and into desolation, taking over their own country, is something that is not shocking. I think that's something that's very, very difficult to explain. I think we could explain why the average person wouldn't speak up against that. They don't have the privilege, but educated Ethiopians and Ethiopians in a position to protest and to kind of ring the alarm at the danger that lurks in allowing Isaias to take over is something that I can't explain, but I think that's for another time, and I'm digressing from our topic. But in terms of the AU, Kjetil, I would want you to say a few words about. I mean, you have been involved in these reconciliation processes in other conflicts, and also you have advised other reconciliation and mediation processes. And what are the things that the AU got wrong, apart from choosing the wrong mediator, and also apart from taking position in the war from early on, and thus disqualifying really itself from playing a constructive role because it had already taken side? But what are the structural problems in terms of the mediation from your experiences in other mediation processes, and what are the things that have gone wrong from the beginning, maybe by design?
Well, there are different approaches to unpack that. I think besides the procedural and the technical, as we have mentioned, the lack of knowledge about what actually this conflict is about, the lack of understanding and knowledge of the history and the anchoring of this current conflict, which started in November, didn't start in November 2020. You can say it started in 2018 with the appointment of Abiy Ahmed. Or, first you can say it started in December 2019 with the dissolution of EPRDF and establishment of Prosperity Party. Or you can say it started with the appointment of Abiy Ahmed as the chairperson of EPRDF in April 2018. Or you can say it started in 2014-2015 when Amhara regional state blocked and barricaded the roads into Tigray and stopped all traffic into Tigray. Or you can say it started with the death of Meles and the withering of authority of EPRDF. Or you can say it started, you can go back into every decade of history to find tentacles of why this conflict are still ongoing. This is what I call Ethiopia's forever war. The challenge towards a centralizing authority of the empire. This is the empire problematique we are facing. And the knowledge of that huge, complicated, nuanced backdrop was totally lacking when it comes to the AU approach. Because they didn't have the expertise, basically. And they didn't have the team to provide him that expertise either. And that's also lacking, you can say, among some of the internationals engaged on this. But the way to approach both belligerent parties in order to learn and understand their reasoning for why they picked up arms is needed in such process. Because, believe it or not, these are rational actors. They have a reason they are fighting this out. It is not some, like usually Westerners are saying, this is a stupid African war. No, they have a rationality behind what they are doing. We shouldn't use that kind of belittling language. We can say it is insane to sacrifice that many people, to sacrifice that much resources to fight this war. Yes, I agree on that. But they do have a political reasoning behind why they are taking up arms, both sides. And they find that justified based on their own political premises. So hence that's where we need to attack, those political premises. How can we handle that? How can we try to unpack those two positions, or those three positions, or four positions, depending on how many belligerent actors you want to involve into this conflict scenario? And then try to connect some of these dots into the common multiple denominator, so to say. I think Obasanjo or the AU approach, and I also think that reflects also the fact on how US and EU has approached it, is too much a most standardized, one-size-fits-all approach to conflict mediation. This isn't like that, in my view. You need to look beyond the surface, as is usual in Ethiopian politics, the wax and gold problematic here.
Yeah.
But you also need to broaden your scope, because this is not only a war between Mekelle and Addis. This involves Oromos, this involves Southerners, this involves Afars, this involves, a much broader problematic when it comes to configuring or reconfiguring Ethiopian statehood.
Yeah, I think you raised interesting point when you said that there is some sort of patronizing or condescending attitude on the part of some actors in the international community, and I think you see that reflected when they say, for instance, well, this is the only way to end the war is when one of the parties totally crushes the other. And the implication there is that there is no way the two parties could be brought together to negotiate when they are both in positions of strength. And I think you will have heard one of the kind of carte blanche permission that Abiy was given. Maybe this could be false, but there is every reason to believe that it was true. With that, unless he was in a position of strength, he wouldn't nudge to kind of negotiate. And the thinking there is that the only way to make them negotiate is by making sure that one of the parties has an upper hand, and that's the only way to make them accept. And also maybe that could explain the kind of the unwillingness on the part of the international community to change course, even though it has become very, very clear that the AU-led process is not going anywhere. But you don't see people kind of investing their time and energy to try to understand what is happening. So I think you're right in terms of this point. I think you want to add something there.
Yes, in the sense that I think what the international community hoped for is that when you had which was actually a US attempt to negotiate a joint statement of ceasefire early this year, which was undermined by Addis Ababa when they unilaterally declared a humanitarian truce, so-called, in March, wasn't it? Yeah. Which was immediately reciprocated by Mekelle, also declaring a humanitarian truce. That was interpreted by the international community as what is called a mutually hurting stalemate in peace theory or conflict theory. But in the face of mutually hurting stalemate, that's the time period when negotiations can take place, because both sides have then reached an awareness that this cannot be won on the battlefields. The sacrifices are too high, the demand of resources are too much, so we need to settle it by negotiation. That's the kind of the mutual hurting stalemate dilemma. But it wasn't a real, genuine mutual hurting stalemate, because it was used as a temporary ceasefire in order to re-recruit troops, to train new troops, to purchase new arms, to restock ammunition supplies, and so on and so forth, in order to prepare for the final offensive. As becomes more and more obvious now that Abiy Ahmed planned to announce a kind of a final victory with the New Year celebrations in the Ethiopian calendar this spring in 12th of September, kind of entering Mekelle once again. So I think that kind of misunderstanding, that kind of lack of awareness, that kind of lack of knowledge about what was actually behind the unilateral truce have also prevented the international community to seize this opportunity with much more vigorousness, much more robustness, kind of laying back a bit and saying, okay, this is now we can fix it. And now AU can kind of push it forward. But AU hasn't done anything. Hence, early in the summer, President Kenyatta took an initiative together with the US again to try to have a parallel track. On the surface saying that AU is in the lead, but they were working separately from Obasanjo in organizing these face-to-face meetings in the Seychelles and Djibouti between Mekelle and Addis representatives and so on. So I think it is a situation where the international community are trying to do, or some actors, US in particular, but also to a certain degree EU, is trying to push forward the process, but not really taking the lead because they feel they cannot, because then they encroach upon the AU. But also, I believe the EU is split. The EU member states have very different opinions on this situation in Ethiopia. Many of the key states actually support Abiy and think Abiy is the best solution and the way forward for Ethiopia. So the EU Commission has to, is as strong as its member states combined, you can say, even though Borrell have some very clear, hard-hitting statements. He is not really dictating the EU foreign policy, even though he has, he's the top guy. But I think the Western countries also understand, at least some of them, that this is a conflict which we probably should not invest too much diplomatic capital in trying to solve, because we don't manage to solve it anyway. So by investing diplomatic capital into something which is unsolvable is just a waste of diplomatic capital. That's a cynicism of international relations. And that's what's also playing its hand here, that better not take the lead, better not take the responsibility, because then we will end up with the blame of not managing to solve it.
So I mean, essentially you're saying that the AU is getting in the way of peace by way of stonewalling any kind of progress, obstruction, and red taping on all that. And I think
they are both. Now the AU statement some days back calling for cessation of hostilities to start. And to access of humanitarian aid. Okay, you can say that's what's the meaning of that statement? The statement doesn't mention Eritrea at all, doesn't criticize Eritrea at all, doesn't say that Eritrea should pull out. The statement comes in a phase where Ethiopia.
If I may interject, I'm sorry, I cut you off, but do we know why? I mean, one explanation, of course, because Ethiopia and the AU doesn't want Eritrea to be mentioned, because the AU is working in close collaboration with Ethiopia. I think that's one explanation, right? But the AU should have an interest in calling out Eritrea normally, because Eritrea has expressed many times through Isaias that it has huge disdain for the AU. And normally you would expect the AU also to take exception to Eritrea invading a country. But I can't understand why the AU would simply succumb to Eritrea, a country that is not friendly to. So explain.
No, that's a good question. I remember the first speech of Isaias Afwerki in the OAU General Assembly. I think it was in August 1991, where he chastised and criticized and condemned all the head of states being there as being corrupt dictators. And where he said, OAU is nothing. You have been working against Eritrea for 30 years and the Eritrean War of Independence, which was true. but Isaias have acted the same as he did in August 1991, has been his position, so to say, towards AU, towards IGAD, towards multilateral agencies and the multilateral agenda. Isaias is principally against multilateralism, because that will be an impediment for his maneuvering, so to say, and his agenda to create instability. But why AU doesn't want to take a strong stand on Eritrea is a very good question. And partly, yes, I think it is reasoned in the fact that Ethiopia doesn't want it to take a strong stand on Eritrea, because Ethiopia and Abiy Ahmed is very much relying upon and depending upon Isaias Afwerki and his military force to crush Tigray. By opening up a criticism of Eritrea and Eritrea's involvement in Ethiopia, AU also accept the internationalization of this conflict, which might hit back on them later on. That's another factor, possibly. So I think it is multiple layers here. The AU surely knows that Isaias is not a friend of AU, but still they have that's a lesser priority in this context, so to say, than to keep him above criticism.
Well, I think we're running out of time, so just one more question, Kjetil, and that is for you to tell us what you think should happen, your advice or recommendation. I ask my guests what they think should happen, and especially I would like to ask you if you think there is a way of bringing the conflict to an end without involving the AU, because it looks like, listening to you, that the AU, if anything, is playing a destructive and negative role. And I think naturally one wonders if there is a way for interested actors in the international community to bypass the AU and devise some sort of solution.
I think as long as the UN Security Council is hamstrung and paralyzed because of the big geopolitical power play between the West and East, so to say, that China and Russia has always blocked then and put down veto in any kind of attempt to really discuss the Ethiopian civil war as a formal agenda item in the Security Council. As long as that situation remains as it is, AU is the lead on paper. But I think what would need to be done is to dilute the AU monopoly, or at least General Obasanjo's monopoly of the process. And that is already ongoing, in a sense, that President Kenyatta is now being appointed by the current incumbent, Ruto, as representative to the conflict. And he should have a prominent role. The former South African high-level minister is also part of a team evolved in trying to present solutions to this, so that you broaden the African representatives in the negotiation team of AU is the first step. But also then, after broadening that team, diluting the role of General Obasanjo, putting him more or less on the sideline, he might still keep a symbolic lead. But the actual work and the actual mediation and the actual pushing the agenda forward is done by other prominent African statesmen. But also broadening the AU, which is also on its way, is to attach the EU representative, is to attach the US representative, is to attach the UK, the Chinese, the other international envoys who are now working on the process. So we have a broader international team of envoys and peace mediators leading this together, more collectively. That might have its drawbacks in the sense that having such a broad collective group to push forward such a complicated process, because these actors will not agree upon the best way forward. So that might again hold them back. I don't see an easy way out of this to design a much more pointed, much more robust, much more stronger, much more competent process. as it is today. I don't see that, with the exception of possible unilateral action by the US administration. That if Washington finally says, no, this is it, this is too much, we cannot allow a genocide in the making on the Tigrayans, we need to stop it. And then their big power muscles, both militarily, security, economically, diplomatically, will come into play in a much more different way we see today. But US hasn't taken that stand yet. Washington is divided upon what the administration should do. And so far the administration, although you see over the last few days, the statements from both State Department and White House representatives are much more critical on Addis Ababa than just a week ago. So they might be tilting back again to a stronger stand on it. And if the Congress is, as we know, there are several actors lobbying in the Congress now for the US to take a much stronger stand and to pass a resolution on the new information we do have with the onslaught on Tigray over the last couple of weeks. That might inspire also a new initiative. But then Mike Hammer, the US Special Envoy, needs to get a new mandate, or Blinken himself need to personally engage at a higher level to push forward then a more US-led process, because AU is failing, and the joint combined multiple envoys will probably not manage to solve their internal disagreement to design an active process going forward. That's the only hope I can see. Whether or not it will happen, I'm not so sure. I will not bet my money behind it. No.
Yeah. Well, yeah, understandable. Thank you for your very insightful views, Kjetil. I think your take on why the AU and how the AU has crippled and held hostage the international community is very pertinent, and I can only hope that some people in the international arena would listen to your view. Thank you so much. But I would just like to say a few words about an essay that you wrote a couple of days ago. What you published, I think it will have taken you a lot of time because it's 50 pages, and you give an excellent account of the journey of the TPLF and the EPRDF. And I think you have given an excellent take on what you think has happened. It's very well sourced, and I strongly recommend people to read it, people who want to understand the EPRDF and the TPLF. And actually, I had hoped that we would talk about it today, but in the light of what has happened, I wouldn't have been opposite to talk about the journey of the TPLF, given that genocide is happening now. So, but hopefully we will have another time to talk about that, Kjetil. So thank you for writing that as well. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, Tghat. I think it is important again for to enlighten a bit about, because the withering and eventual collapse of EPRDF is the primary reason for the outbreak of civil war, as happened 2 years or 1 year after the collapse of the party. So that's why I have untangled that process of how EPRDF, which was looked upon as which was the biggest political party in Africa, one of the second biggest in the world after the Chinese party in terms of membership base, but also was looked upon as the most anchored, robust, strongest incumbent government party on the continent, how it could unravel and collapse so quickly. But it wasn't quickly, because you can see the tendencies going back at least since 2012, 2013, 2014, when it was predicted by insiders that this would lead eventually to a new civil war in Ethiopia. So it is very important to have that knowledge with us when we try to understand the reasoning for the belligerent parties to fight, and then again, which might provide insights into possible solutions. So I'm happy to come back on a later occasion to talk more about that.
All right, yeah, for people who would like to read, it's titled "Falling from Grace: The Collapse of Ethiopia's Ruling Coalition," and is published on Project Muse, and
It's
I think
in a journal of Northeast African Studies.
that's right. That's right. Yeah. Thank you very much, Kjetil.
Thank you.